They fired me for choosing my dying father over a 2-minute meeting. My name is Jack Riley. I'm 47 years old, and for 17 years I thought loyalty to my company meant something. I was wrong. The ventilator kept steady time. I watched my dad's chest rise and fall, 76 years of hard work reduced to this room at Cleveland Clinic. His hands lay still on the white sheets, the same hands that taught me to change oil and throw a curveball. I'd been in that chair since 3 a.m. when the call came. The drive from my apartment in Lakewood had been empty highways through the old steel corridor, past the shuttered mills between Cleveland and Youngstown. Now, at 7 a.m. on a Sunday morning, just the hiss of oxygen and monitors. Those hands told a story. 43 years at Consolidated Steel in Youngstown, furnace tender to floor supervisor. Scars from molten metal, fingernails stained from industrial grease. Crooked pinky finger broken in a machinery accident, never properly set because he couldn't miss work. A man shows up, he used to say, fixing something in our garage on Saturday mornings. I was 8 when he first said it, watching him change transmission fluid in our old Chevy. He said it again when I left for the Army at 18. Said it a third time when I took the job at Bramble and Crest Logistics 17 years ago. Back then, I thought I understood what he meant. Show up for work, be reliable, do your job. But sitting in that hospital chair, watching the man who taught me everything about honor and duty fight for each breath, I finally understood the real lesson. Sometimes you have to choose which job matters most. My phone buzzed. Emergency alignment meeting. 7:09 a.m., attendance mandatory. 2 minutes notice. Sunday morning. While I sat watching my father fight for breath, I looked at the screen, then back at Dad. Gray face under fluorescent lights. Oxygen mask fogging with each shallow breath. For 17 years, I'd answered every call from Bramble and Crest. Built their scheduling systems from scratch when I started as a junior dispatcher. Worked my way up through freight coordination, operations management, finally to director of workforce orchestration. I was the guy who kept 200 trucks moving the I-80 freight corridor, routed emergency medical supplies around hurricane zones, made sure grocery stores stayed stocked during the 2020 lockdowns. I'd missed Danny's Little League championship for a hurricane emergency in Houston. Canceled 3 family vacations for critical projects that turned out to be PowerPoint presentations. Worked through Christmas dinners, Easter brunches, birthday parties. I'd given Bramble and Crest everything. Nights, weekends, holidays, family time. All because I believed showing up meant saying yes to everything. But sitting there, holding my father's hand while machines kept him alive, I realized I'd been showing up for the wrong things. The choice was simple. I typed to my team, status in hospital with Dad, log and update me if critical. Turned the phone face down. Took his hand. For 17 years, I'd been Bramble and Crest's go-to guy. The company had been different when I started. Family-owned, values-driven, led by people who understood that employees were human beings with lives outside the warehouse. Rebecca Martinez, our current COO, had been my mentor through most of that climb. Started the same year I did, worked nights dispatching while raising 2 kids alone after her husband died in Iraq. She understood the business from the loading dock up, the pressure drivers faced, the impossible schedules dispatchers juggled, the constant balancing act between operational efficiency and basic human decency. Rebecca had taught me that good logistics wasn't just about moving freight efficiently. It was about building systems that could handle crises without breaking the people who ran them. Jack, she'd told me during my first promotion to operations manager, the best companies don't just deliver goods. They deliver on promises to everyone, customers, employees, families. The minute you forget that people have lives outside these walls, you stop being a leader and start being a problem. I'd carried that lesson through my rise to director level, built schedules that accounted for family emergencies, created backup systems so no single person carried impossible loads, fought for reasonable overtime policies and genuine work-life balance. My team trusted me because I understood that reliable employees needed reliable support from management. Then Bramble and Crest got bought out by Meridian Holdings, and everything changed. The new ownership brought in Lucius Carter as CEO 18 months ago. Harvard MBA, never worked a day on a dock or behind a wheel. Everything about him screamed corporate consultant, $5,000 suits, buzzword-heavy speeches about synergies and operational excellence, casual mentions of weekend houses in the Hamptons. He'd taken over with promises to modernize our corporate culture and maximize shareholder value. What that meant in practice was longer hours, shorter notice, zero tolerance for anything that might interfere with his quarterly projections. I'd tried to work with him. When he demanded impossible delivery schedules, I'd found ways to make them work through careful planning and calling in favors from drivers and dispatchers who trusted me. When he wanted cost reductions that would compromise safety protocols, I'd found alternatives that satisfied his budget requirements without putting people at risk. When he scheduled mandatory strategy sessions on Christmas Eve, I'd shown up. But the warning signs had been building for months. 3 months before this Sunday morning, Lucius had called a 6 a.m. meeting about accountability standards. Half the management team was bleary-eyed, having driven in from suburban homes in the pre-dawn darkness to accommodate his schedule. Lucius, fresh from his personal trainer and looking like he'd stepped out of a business magazine, had lectured us about commitment to excellence. "Gentlemen," he'd said, his voice carrying that smooth confidence that came from never having been truly tested by real adversity. "Success in today's competitive marketplace requires sacrifice. If you're not willing to bleed a little for this company, maybe you're in the wrong business." Mike Stevens from Cold Chain had raised his hand. Mike was a good man. 22 years with the company, 2 kids in college, a wife undergoing cancer treatment. What about when our families need us to bleed a little for them? Lucius had smiled that cold corporate smile that never reached his eyes. "Mike, that's exactly the kind of thinking that keeps companies mediocre. Champions understand priorities. That's business 101. The room had gone quiet. Rebecca, sitting across the conference table, had given me a look that said everything about what she thought of our new CEO's leadership philosophy. I should have seen the collision coming. Lucius believed that dedication meant complete availability, that loyalty required absolute submission to corporate demands. I believed that real loyalty was earned through mutual respect, that sustainable success came from treating people like human beings rather than interchangeable resources. Looking at Dad's gray face under the fluorescent lights, I finally understood that some battles choose you. The meeting came and went. 2 minutes of theater while I sat bedside, listening to the steady rhythm of machines keeping my father alive. Later, I'd learned that others had missed it too. Marcus Williams from Western Operations, Sarah Chen from Cold Chain, even Dave Morrison, who'd taken over Tom Bradley's role in strategic planning after Tom's retirement. But when the termination memo hit the company intranet at 9:47 a.m., only one name was displayed in bold red letters across every computer screen in the building. Mine. Notice of termination, gross dereliction of duty. The subject line was clinical, the content brutal. After 17 years of building systems, managing crises, and delivering results that kept Bramble and Crest competitive in an industry that chewed up weak companies, I was being branded a deserter. Because I chose to sit with my dying father instead of joining a 2-minute meeting that could have been handled with a group text message. The memo was copied to everyone. Board members, senior management, department heads, even external stakeholders and vendor partners. Lucius hadn't just fired me, he'd made me a public example, a warning to anyone who might dare prioritize family obligations over corporate demands. 6 months earlier, at the annual recognition dinner, Lucius had stood at the podium and called me the backbone of our logistics operation. He'd praised my dedication, my reliability, my willingness to go above and beyond for the company. The whole room had applauded. My picture had appeared in the company newsletter with a quote about how dedication to excellence drives everything we do. Now that same man was using my name as a scarlet letter. I closed my eyes and thought about Dad's lessons, about showing up, about what it meant to be a man you could count on, about the difference between loyalty and servitude. Then I picked up my phone and typed 11 words that would change everything. A man's got 2 jobs. Show up for both. I chose mine. I sent it to my team chat and put the phone away. No explanation, no defense, no corporate speak about work-life balance. Just the truth, stripped down to its essence. Within minutes, the message was spreading beyond my immediate team. What happened next surprised everyone, starting with me. At Bramble and Crest, we had an unspoken hierarchy of toughness. The drivers looked up to the dispatchers who coordinated their routes and handled their problems. The dispatchers respected the operations managers who kept the whole system running smoothly. And everyone, absolutely everyone, deferred to Marcus Williams. Marcus Steele Williams, they called him, though never to his face. 15 years running Western operations, covering everything from Detroit to Denver. Former Marine drill instructor who'd done 2 tours in Afghanistan before coming home to civilian logistics work. A man who'd never shown emotion in any meeting I'd ever attended. Never backed down from a confrontation, never compromised on safety or efficiency standards. His office walls were covered with commendations for on-time delivery rates and safety records. His desk was perpetually clean, organized with military precision. When Marcus spoke, people listened. When he made a decision, it stuck. He was the kind of manager who could handle a blizzard shutting down I-80, a wildfire blocking routes through Colorado, and a driver shortage in the same week without breaking a sweat. His phone call came first, less than an hour after my message had started circulating through company chat groups. "Jack," he said, his voice carrying that familiar gruff authority that had commanded respect from drivers and executives alike. "I heard what happened. My resignation's already in Carter's inbox." I was still processing this when he continued, his tone shifting to something I'd never heard from him before, something almost vulnerable. "You need to know something, brother. My daughter Emma had leukemia when she was 6 years old. She's fine now, 28, married, kids of her own. But there were months back then when I didn't know if she'd make it. Dark months when the doctors couldn't tell us anything except wait and see and hope for the best." He paused and I could hear something crack in that iron voice. I missed one of her chemo appointments for a budget meeting. One. She never said anything about it, never complained, never made me feel guilty. But I remember sitting in that conference room listening to some bean counter talk about cost centers and operational efficiency while my little girl was getting poison pumped into her veins to save her life. Another pause, longer this time. "Been in this business 20 years, Jack. Worked for good companies and bad ones, smart bosses and stupid ones. But I've never seen anything like what Carter just pulled. Firing a man for staying with his dying father? That's not business. That's cruelty dressed up in corporate language." He cleared his throat, and when he spoke again, his voice had returned to its normal command tone. "I won't work for a man who punishes a father for staying with his family." "Roger that, brother?" "Roger that," I managed to say, still stunned that Marcus Williams, Steele Williams, had just opened up about the most painful period of his life to explain why he was throwing away a career over my termination. The cascade that followed was like watching dominoes fall in perfect sequence. Tom Bradley called next, 15 minutes after Marcus. Tom had been my mentor when I'd started at Bramble and Crest, the man who'd taught me everything about logistics operations and more about leadership than any business school could have provided. He'd retired 3 years ago after 42 years with the company, but he was still connected to half the industry through professional relationships and genuine friendships built over decades of honest dealing. "Son," he said, his voice gravelly from 40 years of cigarettes but steady with conviction, "my resignation went in this morning." Told Lucius exactly what I thought of his leadership style. Used some words I probably shouldn't have, but I stand by every one of them. Tom had been there when the company was still family-owned, when the original owners understood that treating employees well wasn't just good ethics, it was good business. He'd seen the industry change, watched companies rise and fall based on how they treated their people during crisis moments. "Back in my day at this mill, a man's word meant something," he continued. "Your father taught you right, Jack. Family first, work second. Everything else is just details." Then came the avalanche. Mike Stevens from Cold Chain called to say his resignation was already submitted. His wife was in remission from cancer, and he'd been thinking about work-life balance a lot lately. "I can't work for someone who thinks family obligations are excuses," he said simply. Pete Rodriguez from Eastern Distribution followed 20 minutes later. Jim Walsh from Strategic Planning called to say he was out. Dave Morrison from Tom's old department submitted his resignation with a note that read simply, "Effective immediately. Personal reasons." By noon, 13 resignations had hit Lucius Carter's inbox. 13 men who'd worked their way up from drivers and dock workers to management positions. Men with mortgages and kids in college, men who'd planned to retire from Bramble and Crest, men who'd built their careers on the foundation of showing up when called upon. Men who'd chosen principle over security. Each resignation was different in its specific language, but they all carried the same essential message: I don't work for dishonorable men. The resignation letters weren't coordinated. There hadn't been time for that. They were individual decisions made by men who'd reached the same conclusion independently, that some lines shouldn't be crossed, some principles shouldn't be compromised, some behavior shouldn't be tolerated regardless of the personal cost. My simple message: a man's got 2 jobs. Show up for both. I chose mine. Was spreading beyond our company like wildfire through dry grass. Screenshots appeared in trucking forums and logistics industry chat groups. CB radio chatter picked up the story and carried it across the interstate highway system. Someone had posted it on LinkedIn, where it was being shared by operations managers and freight coordinators across the Great Lakes region. What had started as my personal response to an impossible choice was becoming something bigger, a rallying cry for everyone who'd ever been forced to choose between work demands and family obligations, a reminder that there were still men willing to stand up for principles even when it cost them something. By 2 p.m., the company intranet was buzzing with activity that Lucius couldn't control. Drivers were printing out my message and taping it to their dashboard radios. Dispatchers had made it their computer screensavers. Someone in the main warehouse had spray-painted "A man's got two jobs" on the break room wall in letters 3 feet tall before security could stop them. The message was simple, direct, and impossible to spin. It didn't attack Lucius directly or criticize company policy. It just stated a truth that resonated with anyone who'd ever struggled to balance competing loyalties, that sometimes you have to choose what matters most. At 3:30 p.m., Lucius tried to regain control of the narrative. Every employee received a link to a live video stream. CEO address, immediate viewing required. I watched from my phone in the hospital corridor, earbuds in, as Lucius sat behind his mahogany desk looking directly into the camera. His hair was perfectly styled, his suit immaculate, his posture radiating the kind of confidence that came from never having been truly challenged by circumstances beyond his control. "We uphold standards at Bramble and Crest," he began, his voice carrying that smooth corporate authority that had impressed the board of directors when they'd hired him. Standards of performance, standards of commitment, standards of professional conduct. If you cannot meet those standards, the solution is simple: leave. It's that straightforward. He talked about loyalty and discipline and sacrifice, carefully framing the mass resignations as necessary house cleaning, the removal of weak links who couldn't handle the demands of a competitive marketplace. "We are not a company for the faint-hearted," he declared, his voice rising with practiced emphasis. "We are an engine of resilience, a force for excellence in an industry that demands nothing less than total commitment. Anyone unwilling to answer the call at any hour, on any day, has already made their choice. We simply respect that choice and wish them well in their future endeavors." The speech was polished, professional, and completely tone-deaf. He was treating the resignation of 13 experienced managers like a minor personnel adjustment rather than a devastating indictment of his leadership style. Then he made the mistake that ended his career. Near the end of the broadcast, probably thinking the official recording had stopped, he leaned back in his leather chair and let out a casual chuckle, the kind of laugh that comes when you think you're among friends who share your perspective. "Besides," he said, his voice taking on an almost conversational tone, "family excuses don't run trucks." 6 words, delivered with a smirk that revealed exactly what he thought about employees who prioritized family obligations over corporate demands. Within an hour, that clip was everywhere. Not the whole speech with its careful corporate messaging, just those 6 words and that dismissive laugh. Shared and reshared across every platform the company's drivers and warehouse workers used. Posted in trucking forums, logistics industry groups, social media pages where blue-collar workers gathered to discuss their jobs and their frustrations. The backlash was swift and brutal. These were men who worked overtime to support their families, who missed school plays and birthday parties to keep the supply chain moving, who'd given years of their lives to companies that promised loyalty in return for dedication. Hearing their CEO laugh about family obligations was like watching him spit on everything they'd sacrificed. While employees across the company and throughout the industry seethed over Lucius's careless words, Champ Patel was quietly doing what lawyers do best, reading the fine print and finding the flaws that destroy seemingly solid cases. Cham was our general counsel, a sharp-eyed immigrant from Gujarat who'd worked his way through law school driving nights for a package delivery service. He understood both the legal complexities of corporate governance and the operational realities of logistics work, which made him invaluable in an industry where regulatory compliance could make or break a company. More importantly, he had the kind of integrity that ran bone deep, the kind that came from understanding what it meant to fight for every opportunity in a country that promised equality under law. He'd grown up poor in Ahmedabad before his family immigrated when he was 12, part of the wave of Indian professionals who came to America in search of better opportunities for their children. His father had worked 2 jobs, days at a textile mill, nights cleaning office buildings, to put Cham through college and law school. In America, his father had told him during those difficult early years, the law protects everyone equally. Rich, poor, citizen, immigrant, it doesn't matter. That's why we came here. That's why you must understand it perfectly. Cham had taken that lesson to heart, building a career on the principle that legal protections meant nothing if they weren't enforced consistently and fairly. He'd never been impressed by corporate titles or intimidated by executive power. When he looked at a contract, a regulation, or a personnel action, he saw only black and white, legal or illegal, proper or improper, right or wrong. At 4:15 p.m., sitting in his office overlooking the main warehouse floor, Cham pulled up the meeting minutes from the morning's emergency alignment session on his computer screen. What he found made his blood run cold and his lawyer's instincts shift into high gear. One signature, that's all the official documentation showed. Mason Carter, Lucius's 23-year-old nephew, fresh out of college with a degree in business administration, and 3 months into an unpaid internship in the strategic planning department. According to the company's corporate governance policies that Cham had helped draft to ensure compliance with SEC regulations and board oversight requirements, disciplinary actions against senior management required signatures from at least 2 corporate officers to constitute a legally valid quorum. One signature from an intern wasn't just inadequate under company policy, it was void under corporate law. But it got worse. Much worse. Attached to the meeting file was a video clip that Mason had apparently uploaded by mistake, probably thinking it was part of the routine documentation required for personnel actions. Cham clicked play and watched Lucius behind his desk, looking relaxed and casual as he spoke to someone off camera. "Just sign it, Mason," Lucius said, not even bothering to look up from his computer screen where he appeared to be checking email. "Doesn't matter what it says. This is only for form anyway. We just need a body in the room to make it official." The camera caught Mason's uncertain voice, young and clearly uncomfortable. "But Uncle Lucius, shouldn't there be other officers present for something this serious? I mean, firing a director-level employee seems like..." "Mason." Lucius's tone shifted, becoming sharp and authoritative. "We've discussed this. You want to learn how business really works? This is how it works. Sometimes you have to make hard decisions quickly without getting bogged down in bureaucratic procedures. Sign the paper." There was a pause, then the sound of paper rustling and a pen scratching across documents. "Good," Lucius said, his voice returning to its casual tone. "Now you understand how real leadership operates. Sometimes the rules are just suggestions." Cham watched the clip twice, his lawyer's mind automatically cataloging the legal implications. Falsification of corporate records, deliberate circumvention of governance procedures, a CEO instructing a family member to create fraudulent documentation for a personnel action. In the context of a publicly traded company with SEC oversight and shareholder accountability requirements, it wasn't just unethical, it was potentially criminal. The video was devastating evidence of deliberate procedural violations, but it was also something more. Proof that Lucius Carter viewed corporate governance as an obstacle to his personal authority rather than a framework for legitimate business operations. At 4:30 p.m., Cham drafted a memo to the board of directors. His language was precise, clinical, and utterly damning, the termination of Mr. Riley appears void ab initio, as the meeting minutes contain no valid officer signatures as required by Corporate Governance Policy Section 4.2.1. Furthermore, attached video evidence suggests deliberate procedural circumvention with possible falsification of corporate records, creating liability exposure of significant magnitude under SEC regulations and potential criminal statutes. He didn't editorialize or speculate about motives. He simply laid out the facts in language that any competent attorney would recognize as a legal disaster waiting to explode. By 5 p.m., every board member had received the memo along with copies of the video evidence. By 6 p.m., emergency board meetings were being scheduled for that evening. By 7 p.m., outside counsel was being consulted about liability exposure and damage control strategies. Lucius Carter had tried to destroy me with paperwork and procedure using the very corporate systems he'd been hired to manage. Instead, he'd used those same systems to destroy himself. The emergency board meeting ran until nearly midnight on Sunday, but I knew none of this as it was happening. I spent that night in the hospital, dozing fitfully in the uncomfortable chair beside Dad's bed, holding his hand and listening to the rhythmic sound of machines keeping him alive. Around midnight, Dad's eyes had flickered open. He'd looked at me for a long moment, his gaze surprisingly clear and focused despite the medications and the oxygen mask. "You stayed," he'd whispered through the plastic mask, his voice barely audible but unmistakably satisfied. "Where else would I be?" I'd asked, squeezing his hand gently. He'd squeezed back with surprising strength for a man who'd been unconscious for most of the day. Called Danny earlier before they brought me here. Told him what happened with your job. He said to tell you he's proud of his old man. Danny had been 16 when this whole ordeal began. My son living with his mother in Parma since our divorce 3 years ago. Smart kid, honor roll student, better at seeing through people's nonsense than I'd been at twice his age. The fact that he was proud of me for choosing family over corporate demands meant more than any performance review or recognition dinner ever could. Monday morning brought phone calls and news I hadn't expected. Tom Bradley called first, his gravelly voice carrying a note of satisfaction I hadn't heard since his retirement party. Board met all night, son. Lucius is out. Suspended pending investigation into procedural irregularities and governance violations. That's the official language. Your termination's been voided, full reinstatement with back pay and a formal apology from the board. Then came the details, filtering through colleagues and industry contacts who'd been following the story. Rebecca Martinez had been named interim CEO, effective immediately. The board had issued a company-wide statement acknowledging serious leadership failures and promising a comprehensive review of management practices and corporate culture. My job was waiting for me, along with a personal apology from the board chairman and assurances that nothing like this would happen again under the new leadership. But the biggest surprise was what came next. Over the following 2 weeks, my phone started ringing with job offers from competitors across the industry. Word travels fast in the logistics world, especially when it involves a story as dramatic as mass resignations and CEO terminations. My response to an impossible choice had made the rounds at competitor companies, and apparently the kind of man who would sacrifice his career to stay with his dying father was exactly the kind of leader they wanted running their operations. The first call came 3 days after my reinstatement. Jim Peterson from Midwest Freight Solutions, our biggest regional competitor. Jack, I've been following what happened at Bramble and Crest. We've been looking for someone with your operational experience and frankly your character. Are you interested in a conversation? Similar calls followed from Continental Logistics, American Supply Chain Systems, and half a dozen smaller regional carriers. Each company wanted to meet in person to verify that the man they'd heard about was real and to explore whether he might be interested in bringing his skills and principles to their organization. The offers kept coming. Formal interviews, detailed discussions about operational philosophy, reference checks that stretched over weeks, salary negotiations that involved significant increases over my current compensation. 30% salary increase, full benefits package, stock options, and a signing bonus, Peterson said during our final conversation, plus complete authority over operations with a seat on the executive committee. Jack, you'd be reporting directly to our CEO with full autonomy over staffing and policy decisions. It was surreal. 2 weeks earlier, I had been branded a failure and publicly humiliated for choosing family over corporate demands. Now I was being courted by companies offering substantial promotions and salary increases specifically because I demonstrated the kind of character they wanted in their leadership teams. The most unexpected call came from Mason Carter, Lucius's nephew, his voice shaky and young over the phone connection. "Mr. Riley, I'm so sorry," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush of guilt and embarrassment. I didn't understand what I was signing. Uncle Lucius said it was just paperwork, that it didn't matter, that it was all routine corporate stuff. I should have asked more questions. I should have refused. He paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing. "I'm sending you the full video file of that meeting. All of it, not just the clip that got attached to the personnel records. Do whatever you need to do with it. I know it doesn't fix what happened, but maybe it'll help prevent something like this from happening to someone else." I looked at the email attachment for a long moment, nearly 20 minutes of video that would completely destroy whatever remained of Lucius Carter's professional reputation. Then I deleted it without watching. Some battles end when your opponent defeats himself. There's no honor in kicking a man when he's already down, especially when that man has a young nephew who's learned a hard lesson about the difference between family loyalty and moral courage. Dad came home on Thursday, weak but breathing on his own, stubborn as ever about accepting help with basic activities. I took a week off, the first real vacation I'd had in 3 years, to help him get settled back into his house on Maple Street in the old Steelyard district, the same house where I'd learned to throw a spiral pass and change brake pads on Saturday afternoons. The house looked smaller than I remembered from childhood, but it was still unmistakably Dad's domain. Tools organized with military precision in the garage, Coffee maker programmed to start at 5:30 a.m. even though he wasn't working anymore. The kitchen table still bearing rings from countless mugs of black coffee shared over morning newspapers and discussions about the Cleveland Browns' prospects for the upcoming season. We didn't talk much about what had happened at work during those first few days. Dad wasn't one for long conversations about feelings and personal revelations, and neither was I. But on Friday evening, as I was helping him organize his medications and understand the new dietary restrictions his cardiologist had imposed, he looked up at me with those clear blue eyes that had guided me through 47 years of life. "Talked to Danny while you were at the store," he said, his voice stronger than it had been since the heart attack. "Told him about what happened with your job, about the company bringing you back and all those other places wanting to hire you." "What did he say?" Dad smiled, the first real smile I'd seen since before his medical emergency. "Said he always knew his old man was tough, but he didn't know you were smart enough to know when not to fight." That hit me harder than any praise from a CEO or recognition from industry peers ever could. "He said something else too," Dad continued, his voice taking on the tone he'd used when I was young, and he had important lessons to teach. "Said he's proud that his dad knows the difference between a job and family. Said maybe when he has kids someday, he'll remember what you did and make the right choice when his time comes." He paused, looking out the kitchen window toward the backyard where he'd taught me to hit curveballs and change spark plugs. "Your mother would have been proud, son. She always said you had a good head on your shoulders, that you'd figure out what mattered most when the time came." Guess she was right. I had to look away, busying myself with organizing pill bottles that didn't really need organizing. "You did right, son," Dad continued. "A man's word to his family comes first. Everything else is just business. Took me too many years to learn that lesson myself, but you figured it out when it counted." That weekend, I made my decision about the job offers. I called Jim Peterson first. "Jim, I appreciate the offer. I really do. The salary increase, the promotion, the autonomy, it's everything I could ask for professionally." "But?" he asked, hearing the hesitation in my voice. "But I'm staying put. My team is here. The people who stood up for me when it mattered, who put their own careers on the line because they believed in doing the right thing. They deserve leadership they can trust. Rebecca Martinez is building something good at Bramble and Crest, and I want to be part of that." I made similar calls to Continental, to American Supply Chain, to all the others. Same message, delivered with the same conviction. I was staying home, staying loyal to the people who'd shown loyalty to me, staying committed to building something better rather than just taking something easier. Rebecca Martinez officially became permanent CEO 3 weeks later, after a unanimous vote of confidence from the board of directors. She'd come up through operations like me, understood the business from the ground up, and had the trust of employees at every level of the organization. Her first company-wide meeting was different from anything we'd experienced under Lucius or any of the previous corporate leadership. No grand conference room with mahogany tables and leather chairs. No PowerPoint presentations about quarterly projections and market positioning. Instead, she set up in the main warehouse, speaking to assembled groups of drivers, mechanics, dispatchers, and office staff all gathered together on the concrete floor where the real work of the company got done. "Look, we screwed up," she began, her voice carrying across the concrete space without the aid of a microphone or the barrier of corporate formality. "We let leadership forget that you're people with families and responsibilities, not just employee numbers on spreadsheets. We let someone turn this company into a place where doing your job well wasn't enough, where you had to choose between work and family to prove your dedication." She paused, looking directly at a group of drivers in the back who'd known her since her days dispatching night routes. "That's not happening again. Not on my watch. When your kid's sick, you go. When your parent's in the hospital, you go. When your family needs you, you go. When we need you here for legitimate business emergencies, you show up. Simple as that. We succeed by treating each other like human beings." Her first official policy memo landed in everyone's inbox that afternoon. Family emergency leave protocol. Immediate supervisor authorization sufficient. No advance notice required for medical emergencies involving immediate family members. No penalty for prioritizing family obligations during genuine crisis situations. It was exactly the kind of policy that should have existed all along. The kind that recognized that employees were whole human beings with complex lives rather than corporate resources to be deployed at will. Of the 13 men who'd resigned in solidarity with my termination, 11 came back within a month of Rebecca's appointment as permanent CEO. Marcus Williams returned first, his simple email to Rebecca reading, "If Jack Riley's staying and you're serious about changing the culture, I'm staying too." The others followed, one by one, as they became convinced that the company was genuinely committed to operating differently. Two chose to stay gone. Tom Bradley remained in retirement, though he sent a handwritten note saying he was proud of how things had turned out and that maybe there was hope for corporate America after all. Pete Rodriguez took a position with a smaller regional carrier closer to his hometown, saying it was time for a change and that he'd learned some important lessons about what mattered most in life. On my first day back after Dad's recovery, I found a note on my desk from Marcus. "Welcome home, brother." Attached was a printed copy of Rebecca's new family leave policy, along with a photo from his daughter Emma's recent wedding, a photo he'd been able to attend because he worked for a company that understood priorities. Some victories are quiet, personal, measured in moments that never make headlines or quarterly reports. This one felt loud enough to hear across the entire industry. 6 months later, I was invited to speak at the National Transportation Exchange in Chicago, the industry's premier annual conference where logistics executives from across the Great Lakes region gathered to discuss trends, challenges, and best practices. The organizers wanted me to talk about leadership during crisis and maintaining values under pressure. I almost said no. I'd never been comfortable with public speaking, and the whole experience still felt too personal to share with strangers. But Tom Bradley convinced me to do it during one of our monthly coffee meetings at the diner on Superior Avenue. "Son, there are a lot of men out there facing the same choice you faced. Maybe they need to hear that it's okay to choose family. Maybe they need permission to be human." The room at the Palmer House was packed with logistics executives, operations managers, and freight coordinators from companies across the industrial Midwest. I kept my remarks simple, direct, avoiding the corporate speak and management buzzwords that usually filled conference presentations. I told them about that Sunday morning in the hospital, about the choice between a 2-minute meeting and a lifetime of regret, about the difference between loyalty and obedience, between showing up and being present. "A man's got 2 jobs," I said, looking out at hundreds of faces that understood the weight of that responsibility. "Show up for work and show up for the people who matter. Sometimes you can do both. Sometimes you can't. But when you can't, remember which job you can't replace." I talked about the 13 men who'd resigned rather than work for someone who punished family loyalty, about companies that succeed by treating employees as whole human beings rather than disposable resources, about the false choice between career success and family responsibility. The response was immediate. Not just applause, but nods of recognition. Quiet conversations breaking out as men shared their own experiences with impossible choices. During the break, a line formed of people wanting to share their stories. Missed birthdays, skipped anniversaries, choices they'd made that they couldn't take back. As I was leaving the conference, a young manager from a shipping company in Dallas stopped me in the hallway. He couldn't have been older than 30, wearing a wedding ring and that particular exhaustion that comes from trying to build a career while maintaining a family. "Mr. Riley," he said, "I've got a 2-year-old daughter. My wife's been asking me to promise I won't miss her birthday next month for a work conference in Los Angeles. After hearing you speak, I know what my answer's going to be." He shook my hand firmly. "Some meetings can wait. Birthdays can't." That conversation made the whole experience worthwhile. One man, one choice, one family that wouldn't have to wonder if they mattered. Today marks 2 years since that Sunday morning in the hospital. Dad is doing well, still stubborn, still insisting he doesn't need help with everything, but stronger. His cardiologist says he's exceeded all expectations for recovery. We have dinner every Sunday now, a tradition that started in that ICU and continues at his kitchen table, usually after Browns games when the weather's good enough for him to complain about their coaching decisions. Danny graduated high school last month as valedictorian, 2 years after this whole ordeal began. He's headed to Ohio State on a partial academic scholarship, planning to study engineering. His graduation speech mentioned learning about integrity from watching his father make hard choices. I had to step outside during that part. Bramble and Crest is thriving under Rebecca's leadership. The company runs more efficiently than ever, but it runs on trust instead of fear, on planning instead of crisis management. Employee turnover is down 60% from Lucius's tenure. Customer satisfaction scores are the highest in company history. We're winning contracts not because we're cheaper, but because our reputation for reliability means something to clients who need to know their freight will be handled by people who care about the work they're doing. Last month, we landed the biggest account in company history, a 5-year deal with a major retailer worth $80 million. The deciding factor wasn't our technology or our pricing structure. It was our reputation for consistency and our track record of delivering on promises. "We know your people will show up," their operations vice president told Rebecca during the contract signing. In this industry, that matters more than saving a few percentage points on shipping costs. Lucius Carter disappeared from the logistics industry after his termination became permanent. Last I heard, he was consulting for tech startups in Silicon Valley, far away from any business where people count on each other to show up when it matters. Mason transferred to a different company in a different industry and, by all accounts, is learning to ask better questions before signing documents that affect other people's lives. The 13 men who stood up when it mattered, we still get together for beers when we're in the same city, a brotherhood forged in principle that tends to last. Marcus Williams got promoted to vice president of operations under Rebecca's leadership. Mike Stevens beat his wife's cancer and learned to prioritize family time. Tom Bradley enjoys retirement and sends Christmas cards with updates about his grandchildren. My phone still buzzes with urgent requests and emergency meetings. But now I know the difference between urgent and important, between a crisis and theater. And when that phone buzzes at 7 a.m. on a Sunday morning, I check it twice before I move, because a man's got 2 jobs. And I plan to show up for both. The choice between work and family isn't always clear-cut. Most of the time, you can find ways to handle both responsibilities without sacrificing either. But when life forces you to choose, when the stakes are real and the decision matters, you learn what you're really made of. I learned that loyalty is a two-way street. That real leadership means creating systems that don't force impossible choices. That companies succeed when they remember that employees are human beings with lives that matter beyond quarterly earnings reports. But mostly, I learned that Dad was right all along. A man shows up. The trick is knowing where you're needed most. What do you do when someone challenges your principles? How do you handle it when you're forced to choose between competing loyalties? Share your thoughts below, and if this story resonated with you, pass it along to someone who might need to hear it. Sometimes the most important lesson isn't about climbing the ladder faster. It's about knowing when to stop climbing and start living.